Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Greetings, Karen.
Greetings, Dan.
What a month it has been, huh?
Right. I mean, with tornado warnings and severe storms and flood watches, and it's just been, an adventure. Yay, summer.
Well, I guess you could take it that route. I was thinking that our show did really good. We were national finalists again with Extension Calling, and, that was voted by our peers in Extension from all over the country. So we're glad that you guys are enjoying it, and we're happy that they're enjoying it as well.
Yeah, and I just want to send a big shout out to all of you who have reached out to contact me and send in or go online to do our evaluation. Those are really helpful, and we want to encourage you to continue doing so if you haven't done it yet. We'd love to hear from you. And you can also send us questions. If there's something that you want to have addressed, that's one of the things we'd love to do for you.
That's right. I've had some of those calls as well, and love hearing from them just all over the place. Ohio, West Virginia, and further. It's nice to hear from different states and people with similar problems and different ideas sometimes, but it's all good. And that's what we're about, sharing ideas and having fun.
That's right. So thanks again for sending in some evaluations. And thanks again to our national committees for nominating us to be national finalists for our County Agents Association.
All right. So I guess going back to your first comment, we've had some timely rain. This past week, we had quite a bit of rain here. I think it was needed. I could tell that the pastures kind of greened up a little bit.
Yeah, it was needed.
Things got moving. And some of those fall crops, right, that we plant, that we want to harvest and sell in September and October, they needed some rain, and they got some rain as well. So that's all good.
Yeah, unfortunately, they've also gotten a lot of humidity, which is really going to put a damper on things as far as trying to keep off powdery mildew and downy mildew. High humidity and warm temperatures, more so the powdery mildew right now, maybe having some issues with that. But today we wanted to talk a little bit more about our grassy situations.
That's right. Yeah. We're actually, we're running a little experiment the way we do, the on-farm experiments around Eastern Ohio. We do a lot of pasture hayfield type experiments, and we're just going to highlight one that we actually did back in 2019. We're going to talk a little bit about stockpiling. Specifically, stockpiling cool season mixed grasses, and just really good way to have feed going into the winter. Most people, I think, when they do stockpile, they like to kind of use it more up front, November, December. Once you get to January and February, things are a little bit sometimes snowy. Sometimes you run out of stockpile food for your livestock. But if you look at the USDA census, a cow-calf operation costs up to $645 to feed per cow. And that is kind of referring to supplemental feeding, like winter feeding. Whether you're baling your own hay or you're buying hay, there's going to be a cost. So stockpiling is just a great way to offset that. And the stockpiling idea is that you're going to take a pasture field that you want to graze later on. So you're really going to basically stop grazing. Ideally, you want to do that early in August. So if you're listening to the show and you're thinking about doing it, it's still a great time to stop grazing and let the grass grow so that you can graze it later. But a lot of people will actually just fence off an area that they want to use for stockpiling early in August.
Or late July.
And, the idea of stockpiling is you just let it grow. You're past the bolting stage of the grass, so you're not going to get any seed heads. So the grass isn't going reproductive. And when the grass doesn't go reproductive, then it typically has more nutrition because it's pushing out more leaves. And in those leaves, you're going to have more protein. So one of the experiments that we actually did back in 2018, I did say 19, but we actually did the stuff in 18 and wrote the paper in 19. So we actually applied some fertilizer early in August. So in this case, it was August 6th. What we did was we had a control of nothing. And we did this in 3 counties in Ohio, all in Eastern Ohio. We did it in Noble County, Monroe County, and let's see here, Monroe and Morgan County, excuse me. Yeah. So Morgan, Noble, and Monroe counties. So what we did is we wanted to kind of increase that stockpile yield, right? So in August, at that time, like I said before, your grasses are done bolting. You're not going to get seed heads at that time because we're kind of past that. And if this is for the cool season grasses, of course. And once you let the grass grow in that kind of situation, you're going to get a lot of leaves. And a lot of leaves equals a lot of nutrition. So we wanted to test a couple things and see the effects of different types of fertilizers. So we did 100 pounds of urea, which is about 50 units of nitrogen. It's actually 46, but close enough. We also did 100 pounds of urea with a urease inhibitor. Which is just a way to stabilize it. Because a lot of times when you're putting down urea in the beginning of August, the middle of August, even towards the end of July, it just becomes so hot and dry that it can volatilize pretty easy. So what we did in this experiment is we used a urease inhibitor, which will prevent the urea from volatilizing. Just kind of stabilizes it on the ground so that once the rain does come, it kind of gets incorporated into the ground and the grass yields will increase. And we also did 219 pounds of ammonium sulfate, which has the nitrogen as well as the sulfur, but it's also a more stable type of fertilizer. So it is more expensive. You are supplementing some sulfur. And at 219 pounds to the acre, it's the equivalent of 50 units of nitrogen. So we kept all the nitrogen applications about the same. And so we applied it, let it go. We had some rains. It was, as far as I remember, it was a fairly typical August, September, October. By the time November came, November 4th is when we harvested the plots. And what we found in the stockpiling situation is that when you do nothing, so we averaged 3 sites. And when nothing was done, we had about 2,219 pounds to the acre, which is, roughly a ton. When we did add the urea, the urease inhibitor, and the ammonium sulfate, those really were about the same, as far as like comparing to each other. There was no major gains between the fertilizer types. We did see, but they were all significantly higher than the control. So we gained 2,839 for the urea, 3,190 pounds for the urease inhibitor and the urea together, and the ammonium sulfate gave 2,800 pounds just like the urea. But when you're comparing, when you're looking at data and you have several plots, so we had quadruplicates in this case, and then we had 3 sites. So when you average them out, there was no difference in whether any type of nitrogen that you applied. So, that is something that you need to consider. And that's what we wanted to test. Is it worth the extra money to go and get the ammonium sulfate when urea is a lot cheaper? So in this case, what we found is, as far as yield goes, it wasn't that big of a difference. Obviously, if the conditions are really hot and dry, the urea can volatilize. So keep that in mind. If you time urea applications right before a rain, you're usually going to have it incorporate pretty good. And once you do that and it's in the soil, nitrogen can move in the soil. It's a charged molecule. And if you have fairly high cation exchange capacity, so a lot less clay type soils, it will stick around a little bit longer. But, if you have the sandy soils, it can leach out fairly quickly. So depending on your situation, you might have different results. But as far as the stuff that we looked at, any fertilizer works and is better than no fertilizer. So we increased the yield maybe 10%. So it's not bad. But one of the other things that we did, this is something that's not necessarily that you're going to notice without a little bit more work, is we wanted to see if the quality changed, right? So yes, we get a little bit more biomass, but what's that quality look like? Because when we talk about cattle nutrition, quality is really important. So when we did look at the crude protein for the control, for urea application, for the urea and urease inhibitor, and the ammonium sulfate, they were all within 0.5 pounds of crude protein from each other. So 9.4 to 10.4. Urea had 9.8. So the urease inhibitor was 10.4, but when you look at the data, there was no differences between them. So quality-wise, we didn't really increase the crude protein content by adding fertilizer, but we did significantly increase the biomass. So what you'll end up with if you do fertilize, according to what we saw, was increased biomass, but not necessarily a major increase. I mean, it's an insignificant increase in protein is what we saw. When you look at these numbers here, one of the things that we've talked about in the past was whenever you mow and you bale and you bale grass or alfalfa or whatever you're baling, once you're curing it. So what you're doing is you're dehydrating it. Sometimes if it's a wet bale, you're fermenting it. But there is a curing process, and sometimes it's fermentation, sometimes it's drying. But what happens is that quality decreases to get it stable. So fresh grass is always the best. So stockpiling is one of those things that I think is kind of a nice intermediate. You're leaving the grass where it is. It is drying down. Stockpiled forages are going to be drier than fresh forages because the grass just really isn't growing that much in November, December. But it is better than baled hay as far as losses go. You're actually losing less in a stockpiled situation versus a baled situation. I'm not saying, you shouldn't, obviously you need to bale hay sometimes because you can't stockpile everything. There are fields that don't have water, for instance. But it is just a great way to have that feed and be ready. And situations where there's a lot of snow, you're not going to be able to really get into that stockpiled forage too easily.
Well, but they will dig down into the snow. If you only have like 2, 3, maybe 4 inches, they'll still dig through it. Now, once you start getting to 6 to 12 inches of snow up in our more northern listeners, then that might be a little much for your cattle. But for our area, especially with the winters that we have had, you think about the ideal-ish thing that comes with feeding stockpiled forage in the wintertime is with our increasingly warm and wet winters, you can help to reduce the compaction and erosion that comes with those winter feeding by moving your cattle throughout your pastures and your paddocks. So you're moving them a little bit at a time, trying to get them through that stockpiled forage, which, because you left it tall, it's got a nice thick and fibrous root system that's holding on to your soil and helping to reduce the overall erosion issues, and also can help ameliorate some of that compaction. So it's really important to recognize that it's not just a potential decrease of
monetary, so it's not just saving some money on baling costs, right? It's also an environmental impact.
Right, yes. I mean, you can reduce the need for your hay. Like some studies have shown an up to 67% reduction in hay needs feeding these winter paddocks. But also, you're having that higher protein availability for your heifers, especially if you're going to be calving fairly early in the spring. Having some nice tall grasses for them to get into can be very helpful to make sure that the nutrient contents are there depending on the stage of life your cattle are in and how those nutrient contents change. But one of the studies I was looking at showed that the protein content at the beginning of winter for stockpiled tall fescue was 16 to 18%. And then for the duration of winter, it stayed over 10%. So that allows you to maintain that fairly high protein content, which again can help reduce the amount of supplements that you're going to need, whether it's soybean meal or cottonseed meal, whatever. Those additional purchases can be decreased, thus you're changing your input costs for your farm. So when you're thinking about how much that nitrogen costs at the application time, think about the other costs that are being offset. And hopefully you've been keeping really good track of your expenses, such as fuel costs, time on the tractor. That is a cost too. Your time, and costs like supplemental feeding. But there's also that issue of water that Dan had said earlier. If you do not have winter water available in those paddocks, when it's cold out, it's not as easy just to truck out a big, what are those
water
things
tank.
called? A big, yeah.
Or like a trough.
Take out a big water tank out there and park it. So it's not quite as feasible for that. So you got to have that water availability. But if you have that and you start thinking about the long-term expenses of installing a water line out into a distant pasture field to install this type of rotational grazing, then you really can recoup those costs.
See, Karen, I'm going to be a little bit on the cautious side here. I know, like, you're right. You know, when I was talking about you can't solely rely on stockpile forages because the cattle don't always have access to it in the wintertime.
Yeah, this is true.
You're right. It's been the case where they have, in the past few years. It seems like we've got very little snow, at least down on our end of the state. Up in the lake, they have their own world up there, and it's a very white Christmas type world. Just a lot of snow, right? But it's not always the case, right? So you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you did some poor planning. Just be ready for a winter. Like don't assume that it's just gonna be like a very mild winter, very little precipitation or snow. You just don't know. So it's good to be ready for both,
Right. Yeah. And one of the ways some farmers get around that is to have some bales spread out in their pastures so that, or they'll roll out a bale on top of the snow to help, allow them to still spread that manure for you so that you don't have to get your loader in and scrape out your feeding lot or your winter feeding pad and things like that. You let the cattle spread their manure all by themselves, and it's a much more pleasant experience. So spreading bales out could be an alternative for that as well.
So one of the things you were talking about, Karen, was the cattle nutrition requirements, right? For maintenance, for growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have some numbers that I kind of wanted to share as well. And you just kind of beat me to it. So when we did our study, right, we had the control of nothing, where we still got some decent stockpile forage. And we also looked at the quality of the 3 treatments and the control, right? And when I said they were all within like 0.5% from each other. So the control was at 9.4, urea was at 9.8, the urea and the urease inhibitor is at 10.4, and the ammonium sulfate is at 10.1. Yes, there's kind of a swing there, but it was nothing significant. So I'm actually looking at a table here from Alabama Extension, and they have a nice chart here of cattle nutrition. So they got 1,000-pound cow weaning a 7-month-old male, right? And they have the nutritional needs, and they put them in order of months post calving, right? So in a situation where that cow just calved, right, 1 month and 2 months out, we'll say the first 3-4 months of nutritions are going to be highest there because, that's when the cow's lactating and the calf is nursing. So if you look at the crude protein requirement for that milk production and maintenance of that cow, so this is a 1,000-pound cow with about 450-pound calf, 8.7% 1 month after calving, 9.1% is what they calculated 2 months after calving, 8.4 3 months, 8 4 months, 7.5 5 months, 7.1, 6 months, and then at weaning, it drops to 6, right? So if you look at the numbers for the stockpiled forages, like I said, they were all in the 9s and the 10s. So, we're talking about the nutrition that we saw in those fields would suffice for a lactating cow with a calf. Obviously, the larger the calf, typically the larger demand. So if you're looking at a 535-pound calf, 1,000-pound cow, you're looking at crude protein requirements in the 12s, 12.1, 12.9, 12, 11.1, 10.1. And then as you get closer to weaning, it drops to 9. So in that case, you're going to have to do a little bit of supplemental feeding if you want to reach those numbers. But they're not terribly off. So one of the best tools that we haven't really talked about in a while, Karen, which is surprising, is the body condition scores, right? So in a situation where you got a calf nursing, whether we're talking cows or whether we're talking goats or sheep, that body condition score is everything. That'll tell you whether you need a supplement. That'll tell you whether your hay is adequate. And those decisions are going to impact the bottom line, and they're also going to impact the weight of that animal for both rebreeding and health. So keep an eye on that. But just understand that in most situations, I would say that a stockpiled field that was, in this case, we have a lot of tall fescue and orchard grass. And, it's something that we didn't really touch on is, when we talk about the endophyte and the tall fescue, in a stockpiled situation where you don't have seed heads and you're past a frost, that is usually when the toxin is at its lowest. So it works really well for that. The other nice thing about the Kentucky 31 tall fescue in a stockpile situation is that it's a very waxy type grass. So it is very resilient to droughts and hot temperatures and whatnot, like cold temperatures as well. So it'll hold up. And the fact that the environment conditions are such that usually that endophyte toxin is lowest in a stockpiled situation, a winter feed situation in November, December, it works out really good. And there are certain situations that really maybe not the best grass or the most desired grass can be the best.
Yeah. Well, there's also some other precautions you want to take when you're looking at these stockpiled fields. I had mentioned earlier that, maybe if you're calving in the spring, then that would be a good opportunity for you. But there is a light of caution in there, because if you're doing your job the way you're supposed to be doing, you've got some good body condition score on your heifers or your cows going into winter, then you may not want to put them in that higher protein field right before calving, because higher nutrition right before calving, you're going to have larger calves. You may have some problem with those birth weights. And so, that third trimester, mid-gestation, maybe don't need that higher quality of feed. But if you had some thinner cows going into wintertime, maybe you can use that higher quality stockpiled field to get a little bit of weight back on them before you get to calving season. And you're looking at your weaned cattle. They're going to like that higher protein level in that stockpiled forage. And, even if you just have some backgrounders, lowering your feed costs is always a great opportunity. But do recognize that stockpiled grass could be a little too good, depending on what stage your cattle are in as far as that calving rotation. So if you calved in the fall and they're nursing, you have your calves out there starting to get a couple bites of grass, that stockpiling for those group, that's again going to be a really good opportunity for you to save on some of those supplemental feed costs.
Absolutely right. And there is a place for low quality hay as well.
Oh yeah.
Like Karen was saying, if you got a cow that doesn't really have high nutrient demand, or she's getting a little, bigger and, you kind of want to adjust that body condition, because honestly, there is an ideal body condition for breeding, and it's not bigger is better. It's a situation where that that 5 and 6 body condition, the healthy, not excessively developed, that more muscular tone where we can see more definition in the cows so that they're not excessively fat. They actually breed better in that 5 and 6 body condition than they do in that 8 and 9.
Oh, yeah.
Where they're very obese. So don't think that bigger is always better. I would say that bigger cows are better than cows that are too thin. It's probably easier to drop some weight on the cow than it is to put weight on a cow, especially in the wintertime.
Especially if you have a cold winter.
Yeah, and if you spring calved, then that calf has nursed all summer long, and let's just say even going into the fall, and it's had its toll on that cow. And that cow's been dropping some weight, and you're getting into wintertime and she's a little thin. That might be a challenge. So try not to get in that situation. I know sometimes it happens, but when it does happen, know what you have and plan accordingly. Do a forage analysis. Do a little bit of supplemental feeding to a group that you think is a little thin. Mm-hmm. Get that weight back on there, because the colder it gets, the harder it is to put that weight on.
I remember when I first started here, one of the things I was told about was you got to beware of that boss cow that will push the other cows or heifers away from those supplemental feeding resources. And so don't be afraid to separate them out. If you have some cattle that have different nutritional requirements, that need a little bit of extra feed, and maybe they're a little bit more timid, don't be afraid to separate them out, to give them what they need. We do it with our pets too. So if you have one dog that wants to eat out of both food bowls and wants to push the other dog out of the way, we separate them, right? So don't be afraid to do that to your livestock as well. You are in charge of your farm. You got to make sure that not only are the cattle working for you, you're not working for the cattle, but you also want to make sure that you're being the best steward of these animals and of the land as you can. And if you ever have questions about whether or not how to do body condition scoring, if you're worried about how to do a forage analysis, how to interpret a forage analysis, reach out to your local extension office and ask for help. That's what we're here for. That's what the Land Grant University mission is to get our information out to the general public. And so we're here for you, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.